muchas gracias. Muchas gracias en nombre de este grupo por aceptar esta invitación. Tenemos mucha expectativa de escucharte. Ya le conté al grupo que tú vas a hablar en inglés porque te sientes más cómodo haciendo la exposición en inglés, pero después podemos hacer, si te parece, la discusión y las preguntas en español o inglés, como todo el mundo se sienta más cómodo. En todo caso, bienvenido, Marcelo, y adelante.
Sí, gracias. Perdón, Marcelo, le voy a pedir a Armando si dice su nombre, el nombre de la charla y la fecha para que después se sepa qué día fue y cómo quedó grabado.
Muy bien. Entonces, vamos a repetir. Pues hoy es 2 de septiembre y tenemos el honor de tener a Marcello Estevão, que del Banco Mundial, quien nos va a hablar de la situación macroeconómica internacional y las limitaciones que pone para el manejo de las economías de los países de América Latina y en particular de Colombia. Adelante, Marcelo.
Gracias. Déjeme mostrar la pantalla acá. ¿Están viendo la presentación? Perfecto.
Sí.
Perfecto. Sí, déjeme cambiar para inglés solamente porque a la margen es un poquito más fácil para mí de hablar de economía en inglés do que de hablar en portugués, francés o español. So again, it is a great pleasure to be here to talk about how the Latin American region and Colombia should manage more macroeconomic policies in light of the current international context. There's a lot to discuss on this topic, so let me actually give a general view of my thoughts on this, what's happening broadly, before I go over some slides. The slides will then focus on what's going on right now with an emphasis on the inflation issue. So let's do a bit of what I would say economic journalism for, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes. Then I go to the slides, will be a bit more technical. Actually, before I do that, let me just say that even though you asked me to talk about what's happening right now and how this affects the region, this talk is more about cyclical issues, but let me state right from the beginning that I believe that the biggest problem in Latin America nowadays is low potential growth. And that is because Latin American countries are much better prepared to react to the shocks we are facing today than, say, 40 years ago, when the Fed was facing significant inflationary pressures. The Fed actions at the time triggered that crisis in Latin America, and the mechanism that generated those crises have some similarities to what we are living through right now. For instance, then Latin America countries had large debt loads. Now they also do. Then, as now, the global economy experienced unique macroeconomic shocks that sent inflation soaring, the Arab oil embargo then, and the pandemic and Ukraine war now. And then, as now, central banks around the world, especially the US Federal Reserve, were raising rates quite aggressively then, now a bit less aggressive, to fight inflation. There's a big difference between then and now. You know better than I do. There have been enormous improvements in economic and financial policy in the intervening period. Many Latin American central banks have now moved quickly to deal with the inflation problem. Colombia lagged a bit, I'll come back to that, and guide the economies back to target inflation levels. And inflation target is a big innovation. Moving early to raise rates has helped to keep exchange rates in check in the region. It is true that some currencies, for instance, in Chile and Colombia, currencies have depreciated markedly in recent months, but feedback loops through inflation seem tamer than in the past, at least to me. And Latin American economies have also undergone structural improvements that make them much more resilient than during the 80s. Independent central banks, adoption of floating exchange rates and inflation target, like I mentioned, the strengthening of policy institutions have gone far in bolstering most Latin financial systems, which reduces the country's reliance on dollar-denominated debt and short-term financing, with local debt becoming the main source of government funding. This explains why the large economies were able to implement large countercyclical programs to protect families and firms from the worst impacts of the pandemic crisis. This fiscal response would have been unthinkable in decades ago. And by the way, that's also the root of why, say, a country like Brazil, in the situation that it is right now, with very large debt to GDP ratios, but mostly domestic debt and basically no external debt, is this strength of the domestic capital markets that allowed the Brazilian government migrate from issuing debt in dollars to issuing in local currency. Anyway, these improvements in macroeconomic management produced a growth bonus to the region, but on average, growth is still way too slow. Colombia is actually doing a bit better, certainly better this year. Anyway, I could talk about this issue now. There's a more structural issue, but let's go back to the topic of the meeting. And just to continue a little bit on financial journalism, I was in Jackson Hole last week. The conference itself was interesting, and personally, it was actually quite nice, to see many friends and colleagues in such a beautiful setting. I would say the overarching view of all participants in the event was that the Federal Reserve needs to continue its tightening path. The Fed chair's, highly anticipated speech mirrored that sentiment, and it was viewed as hawkish by market participants. Several ECB officials echoed Jay Powell's hawkish tone for the economy, and following this week's release of 12-month accumulated inflation in August of 9.1% for the euro area, the market's now pricing a 75 basis points increase in policy rates by the ECB next week. In my opinion, recent US inflation has been boosted by significant demand pressures, with supply shocks dissipating. But in continental Europe, an energy crisis will make inflation much more resilient, especially if the coming winter is harsh. Meanwhile, market sentiment in the United Kingdom is very bleak, with the market analysts and the Bank of England all in agreement that the country will fall into recession now in 2022. I invite you all to read the inflation report by the Bank of England, which is actually an incredibly sincere report. So what happened this week? And then I'll go back to the mechanism that brought us to where we are now. On impact of the Jackson Hole event, the S&P 500 declined promptly on Friday and continues to retreat this week. This movement has been mirrored by all the stock markets in developing countries. Across the world, Chinese equities have underperformed, while the People's Bank of China continue to step up efforts to stem the renminbi depreciation. Today's the strong employment release in the United States has stoked this bearish sentiment in financial markets, with the idea that the Fed is going to keep tightening, maybe more than was priced a week ago. Corporate earnings would matter tremendously for what's going to happen with the US stock market, and economic activity does repercussions on emerging markets. It seems clear to me that the recovery rally in asset prices from mid-June to mid-August was prompted mostly by falling real interest rates rather than, say, the so far resilient corporate earnings. This week, I was checking, 1 in 10 equity analysts have lowered earnings estimates for S&P 500 constituents, so firms that are included in the index. So while a downward revision of corporate earnings seems consistent, given recession worries, these expectations seem quite benign to me still, if you compare to previous recession episodes. I remember when I was at the Fed, we always looked at how historically bottoming in US stock markets has coincided with 1 in 5 equity analysts lowering their earnings estimates. Right now we have 1 in 10, so there's still quite a way to go in terms of pessimism in the equity side. The impact on emerging markets have been very clear. Several emerging markets continue to see non-resident outflows for local currency bonds, particularly in the government bond market. China is also experiencing outflows from local bonds. Unlike other emerging markets, portfolio outflows from China in the first quarter of 2022 were unprecedented, and they have continued all the way at least till July. Also, does my team tell me? It's based on estimates, not on hard data. Capital flight stands in sharp contrast to the large inflows in 2020 and 21, when investors increased their exposure to Chinese bonds by 30 to 40% each year. So while there are many reasons, maybe why there's some effect on the currency and on flows in China, like COVID lockdowns, the shrinking rate differential with the United States, I do think that the more fundamental reassessment of geopolitical risk seems to be the key factor in explaining these capital movements. And that's already kind of a sign of the world we are living in. You can actually date the increase in these outflows by after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So it does seem that there's a big geopolitical factor in these outflows from China. Again, they are not the largest among emerging market countries by any means, relative to foreign investors' initial position. But what makes China bond flows remarkable is their sharp swing negative. For 2 straight years, investors increased their China allocation the most, and then suddenly that changed. So let me end the economic journalism part. I see I have been talking for like maybe 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, by mentioning what's happening in Colombia, at least from my eyes, and you know much more than I do about that. The Colombia's economy is still growing a lot in 2022. My team
Marcelo, a question: are you going through your presentation, or you are not using it?
I'm going soon. I'm just doing this to abbreviate because I have too many charts, so you can already tell why I'm showing a particular slide.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So Colombia's economy is still growing a lot in 2022 compared to other countries in the region, near 6%. And that's in part because fiscal policy continues being lax. Monetary policy is only catching up. So differently from Brazil, for instance, which started adjusting policy rates much earlier. In terms of trade shocks, have been fantastic for Colombia's trade profile. High prices of oil, coal, and coffee. And as a result, Colombia posts the highest growth rate this year in LAC. So, but yet Colombia and Chile have been put on a negative watch list by international analysts. Current account deficits are growing very large, and there were unexpected rapid currency depreciations in June and July as capital outflows, like I mentioned before, demonstrated concerns are high for those countries. The outlook is much less positive for 2023. Growth may be at 3% next year. Both countries have new leftist presidents, and markets perceive more political uncertainties because of that, particularly because such governments feel a lot of pressure to spend in social areas at a time when fiscal policy is overextended. So let me end by saying there are open-ended questions about how the governments for both countries will manage the post-pandemic fiscal landing, let's call that. I just heard that the new government in Colombia has proposed a tax reform that would produce maybe between 1.3 to 1.8% of GDP in new resources. But the idea is to use all this new financing to implement new government priorities, which makes me a bit anxious about that. So let me now flip through the slides. I have a lot of slides. That's why I decided to kind of talk very quickly about a quote unquote, a little bit of everything that's going on right now in macro around the world. And the slides are going to serve to focus a little bit the discussion. I can distribute to you. You can send me questions afterwards. So first, like I said, inflation is the main concern for policymakers nowadays. I think in the US, the recent signs of inflation stabilization are driven by energy prices. Food price inflation is still pretty I would say pretty strong so far, although there is some signs that price of food commodities have been coming down, and you should see some of this result in US inflation reports as well. Short term, hang on, there is a problem here. I had to change my screen. No. Sorry. Yeah, short-term inflation expectations have been going above long-term inflation expectations. That's what you see in the chart on the left, on the blue line being above the red line. Inflation uncertainty has increased, and the volatility, the bond market volatility has gone up as well. So this chart on the right shows the difference. You can look at what's happened recently vis-a-vis, for instance, the great financial crisis, and you see bond market volatility is still below than the peak of the great financial crisis, but it's going up, or has gone up. There's a whole discussion in the U.S. if there can be a soft landing of the economy by reducing the number of vacancies being posted by employers, or if you need unemployment rate to increase. I mean, I find this discussion a bit silly, I have to confess. It's between some academics and some officials of the Federal Reserve. If you think the equilibrium unemployment rate in the US is 4.5, if you're generous, maybe 5. Unemployment rate was released today, was 3.7%. You need to go above that to control inflation. I find hard to believe that you can do that by just improving the match between job vacancies and unemployed workers, which is the implicit argument of some people at the Fed that tend to be on the dovish side, that you can, reduce the tightness of labor market through the job supply side while keeping the unemployment rate more or less unchanged. So it will go up. I would expect maybe go up to 5 to 5.5. And this, by the way, historically is a low unemployment rate in the US. And U.S. monetary tightening episodes, as you know, have been being a sign of that recession in Latin America will happen. On the left, you see periods of Fed tightening and a table and showing how this relates to starting of recession in the U.S. The very last episode is a little bit of a cheating thing because there was a tightening in the U.S. and the recession is really caused by COVID. So there's not such a correlation right there. It's more of a coincidence, let's say. But in the right side is the chart that matters for us here. You do see lack real GDP per capita growth. In the same chart was the shaded gray areas that show the recessions in the US and how the two are quite correlated. Financial markets have priced this the monetary policy. This blue curve that is above the red curve shows the difference between August and May. If I were going to plot this week, would be even above the blue curve, the current market pricing for future Fed rates. Now, having said that, if you look at a broader measure of liquidity, financial conditions are not too tight right now. That's what this chart is showing. That indicator basically is a summary indicator of many other variables, including stock market positions and lending conditions by loan officers in the US. And as you can see by the end of the chart, the broad financial conditions are still relatively accommodating. Now, this variable is going to change, I expect, quite significantly, in particular starting September and October, when the Fed is going to increase the pace of retiring let's say, increase the pace of quantitative tightening, as the Fed is going to lower the amount of purchase they make in the market quite remarkably. And you are going to be seeing a much faster decline in the Fed's balance sheet. I expect this chart. So you're not going to see as much in the rate side, because that's already priced in. But on the quantity side, you're going to see a significant tightening, and this index may be going up a bit more rapidly than. So growth projections around the world has been continuously coming down. Like I said in my brief summary before, this chart shows how the forecasts for the US, the Eurozone, Japan, and China have been sequentially downgraded since March 2022. The same is true for 2022, a little exception for China, as consensus forecast seems that to think that there will be a payback, a small payback from the fact that part of the weakness in China now is due to temporary factors like COVID lockdown. Many commodity prices have reversed surges while US dollar has strengthened. As I said before, after September or October begins, I think I will see more of a strength in the US dollar as more broadly financial conditions are going to tighten in the US. That has affected basically all the currencies, all major currencies and emerging market currencies have depreciated against the US dollars. The commodity price decline, let me talk a little bit more about that, is going to have implications for Colombia and for the region. Here I'm showing the consensus forecast that actually underlie a lot of our forecasts for economic activity going up, going forward. You see that expectation crude oil prices, coal prices are going to come down significantly in the forecast horizons. So the boom that Colombia is facing now is going to be less going forward. So you should expect less of a boom from the external side, from the commodity side for Colombia going forward. One thing that is interesting that we notice is that there has been a slowdown, there has been a major slowdown everywhere, and the historical growth correlation between G7 and Latin American countries has increased, actually more than the correlation vis-a-vis China. So it's hard to tell if the change is permanent or transitory effect of the pandemic, a typical growth. The way that this chart is showing this is the blue dots here show our benchmark model to estimate these elasticities with data all the way to the end of 2021. And the red dots show the same estimates with data stopping at the end of 2019. Just the inclusion of 2 years of data was enough to show a higher. So if you are looking at the horizontal axis, you see that the blue dots are to the right of the red dots, meaning the elasticity vis-a-vis G7 growth is higher. So if you see a decline, significant decline in G7 growth, that should have more of an impact than historically in the region. For China, it's a little bit of that, but it's not. If you twist your head and look at the vertical axis, it's not as clear. That's a source of concern, unless this is a bit spurious. So those elasticities are going to go back to normal. This just shows a bit what has been happening in the region. Before this week, I would say that, you see this deceleration in Chile and Colombia. These are the 5th and the 6th rows here. Economic activity really going relatively fast in Colombia, but decelerating on a quarter-on-quarter basis. Still strong at a year-on-year basis in Q2. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was an increase of, 11%, something enormous, Q2 of 2022 over Q2 of 2021. I may be wrong, I'm quoting by memory, but was still significant. But we see that continue to go down as in the second half of the year, and certainly be worse in 2023. One observation about the region is quite interesting how in Brazil, economic activity is coming in much stronger than people expected. There was a release on GDP release for Brazil yesterday that shows in the second quarter actually an acceleration, so growth of 1.2%, seasonally adjusted, not at annual rate, and all the forecasts are moving to close to 3% for Brazil growth this year. So there's interesting event in the region. It's a big country. It may affect some of the other countries in the region, less Colombia, but more Paraguay, Uruguay, and maybe Argentina. Another aspect is, despite the commodity boom, when I look at this chart that my team sent to me, I would say the current account deficit is widening in many countries. If you focus on Colombia here, you see still significant current account deficits. By, I think the last data point here is the beginning of 2022, but I think this hasn't changed as much since then. Same thing for Chile. There's less of a current account imbalance, deficit in Brazil, but it's still a bit negative. But you also see kind of this pattern in other countries in the region. So this widened current account gap and exacerbated, capital account volatility is quite a risky cocktail, I would say, especially when the Fed is taking the punch bowl away, is raising rates. This chart shows on the left the flows, net flows from emerging markets. That's for all emerging markets, not just Latin America. As you can see, it's mostly negative in the last couple of years. And in the right side, you see the volatility, you see the big increase in the volatility on these flows, actually significantly higher than during the global financial crisis or during the 2013 paper tantrum. I was in the market at the time, by the way. We could talk about 2013. Was quite traumatic. And now I'm going to go a bit faster because I already mentioned that in my summary before I show the slides. And here, the only message I want you to get from this is that there is quite an array of dispersion on external finance needs and reserve adequacy in the region. That's the last chart. So it's the southeast chart here that shows, say, in the case of Colombia, Colombia still is within the reserve adequacy range that is between 100 and 150%. So reserves are basically almost 50% above what's the metrics for adequacy for reserves is signaling. Chile is quite close to the edge there, close to 100. And then we have countries like Bolivia, Argentina, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, quite below. And Brazil is above. Peru has a lot of reserves. So there's this range here. I would say that Colombia is okay, but this current account debts that seem still kind of resilient make me pause a bit about the situation of the country on the external side. On the fiscal front, there is a significant effort still needed to stabilize debt to GDP ratios at the 2021 level. And if you look at Colombia, the country needs a reversal of the primary balance deficits that we see so far. So Colombia is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 countries from the left to the right. And you see there significant primary balance deficit there. The average for 2022 to 2024, as expected by my team, is still negative. And you see that we estimate that you need close to 2% of a primary balance surplus to stabilize that. Now, if you look at countries like Brazil, the debt stabilizing primary balance is huge. It's almost 7%. Like I mentioned, Brazil is producing some primary surpluses, but it's very small. And it's a big problem. It's not an external sustainability problem. 95% of this debt is domestic, but still, it's a big problem. And with elections coming up, it is a source of tension. And you should see quite a bit of volatility in financial markets, depending on what the main candidates in Brazil say. Other countries are in bad situation as well. Argentina, with close to 5% needed that primary surpluses to stabilize that GDP ratio. Barbados is in crisis. It has even higher, needs a higher surplus than Brazil, although the country is signaling a 3% primary surplus for the next 3 years, which is quite remarkable, just not enough to reverse the situation. Now, this is just an aside. As it was this afternoon, I was putting some charts together, and I was looking at what's happening with national oil company equity prices. And it's clear to me that beyond thinking about macro adjustment and the need to adjust the fiscal, taking care of assets through predictable policy and robust SOE governance is quite important. What this chart here is showing is the national oil company equity prices for Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia. As you see in the case of Petrobras and even YPF, you see the equity prices have been responding, going up, and but not in Colombia. So that made me a bit concerned that that would be associated to the elections of the new president. It's truly a question that I have. I don't know if that's the case. Why, with oil prices still high, you do have this, I would say, relatively low active price for Colombia, for Ecopetrol, compared to Petrobras and YPF? That is really a question that posed to you. You are the experts, not me. I was just surprised. As I said, inflation is a common global trend across the developing world. Here I show different regions. EAP is East Asia Pacific, MNA is MENA, Sub-Saharan Africa is yellow, Europe and Central Asia is blue, and South Asia region is in orange. As you see, Latin America is in the middle of the pack. You see much more of an impact on Europe and Central Asia. That's because they're closer to the crisis in Ukraine, and closely followed by East Asia. By South Asia. Yeah. Anyway, so Latin America also has an upward trend there, but it's not alone. One thing that's interesting that we have seen a significant trend in relative price of food stuff, and that's true everywhere, but in particular in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that's what this chart is showing. It's showing the relative price of food, and the chart starts in 2000, and you see it keeps going up. So that's basically price of, you look at the CPI basket, look at food items, and do that relatively to the overall basket. It's going up kind of in many places, but in Latin America is the most. The implication for this is described a little bit here. If you look at this, the relative price of food has jumped in Colombia lately by almost like 26%. That's the green line that you can see was kind of in the middle of the pack and then suddenly became the second, below, I think it's Guatemala, the top country there with the worst trend. Chile, Brazil, and Paraguay also saw a jump in the last few months by about 12% in the relative price of food. Of course, that affects the poor. It is a big deal. That made me think, maybe what this is saying is that there has been a big relative price shock. That's what's driving inflation everywhere, because we know that in the past, there's a negative relationship between, say, a few goods having above price changes. They tend to be actually episodes that have some particular items having much higher inflation than the average, actually tends to be correlated with high inflation. That just says that, supply shocks move inflation. This negative association is found in the US and in other emerging regions, as this chart shows. It's a negative correlation between the share of expenditures with inflation above average. So the lower it is, the higher is the monthly inflation for countries. That's also true in Latin America. That's what I show here. But what's interesting is that the green dots here in Colombia, Chile, Brazil are the recent episodes, correspond to the recent months. And as you can see, they're all above that negative relationship, which suggests that many other factors than relative price changes explaining the high inflation in the region. So relative price changes matter, but it does seem that there is an overall inflation movement happening there. Also in other places, but clearly in Chile. Chile is very clear, also in Colombia. Then I thought, okay, does this complicate monetary policy? In other words, is that too much of a supply shock? Or too much of a global factor, inflation, does that limit monetary policy effectiveness in Latin American countries? That's not the case. We did a decomposition of inflation into global factors and domestic factors. That's what this table on the right shown. And then you can see that most of the variance in inflation, it is driven by domestic factors. So in any case, so that seems quite clear. It is a bit interesting, though, that in Chile and Colombia, global factors are the most relevant. So 26% of the inflation in Chile is explained by global factors and 36% in Colombia. But still, about 74 and 64% are driven by domestic factors. Anchor inflation expectations is essential for controlling inflation. Consensus expectations have all of the countries converging to target by 2026. Takes a while. If you look here at the chart, by next year, end of next year, the countries are still Colombia, Chile, not Brazil actually, but are still away from the target band. Although in the case of Brazil and say Paraguay, is because the band is very wide. But still, so it's going to take a while for inflation to converge to the target. And in part, I think it's because inflation expectations tend to be quite sensitive at the 2 to 3 year horizon to shock inflation surprises. That is what this table shows. We did some econometrics showing a significant effect of inflation surprise on 2 year ahead expectations, but not in 5 year ahead expectations. So you should expect some persistency there in inflation, at least in the expectation side. It's quite important that central banks in the region are active, curbing this movement. As I mentioned before, Colombia started a bit late, raising rates compared to other countries. Brazil started actually quite early, but also Mexico started earlier. So it's important to keep monetary policy quite active there. Now, of course, inflation will affect public finances. You see how public debt by region, I'm separating here by region. You see LAC is Latin America. It's the second highest ratio of debt to GDP. Compared to, say, Middle East is still high, Middle East and North Africa. But LAC has the highest ratios in emerging markets regions compared to Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asian Pacific, and Europe and Central Asia. Inflation, now when I was doing this and I thought, well, inflation lowers the debt burden at first, but it's actually, it makes harder for countries to issue debt in the long run. In particular, when inflation goes down, the prime debts will have to adjust to keep debt from rising. Why am I saying this? Let me go, I'm talking too much, so I'm looking at the clock. Let me just go straight to the second chart here. Well, I'm just saying that at first, inflation is a tax, basically. So of course, it's going to help the fiscal side. And here we calculated the seigniorage, revenues from seigniorage and the inflation tax for you, so you can take a look. It's non-trivial. So we are talking about, 2% seigniorage for 2021 and 1.1% of GDP on inflation tax for 2021, for instance. So it is significant. So it does help at first. And also, inflation affects fiscal revenues more than expenditures. That's what this econometrics is showing. The coefficients for revenue expenditures in this relationship between inflation and fiscal variables is higher for revenues, which means that when inflation goes up, as we know, the governments collect more revenues. Expenditures tend to go up, but less, and then you have some kind of a beneficial effect on impact. But of course, I mean, inflation affects the fiscal in many other ways. In particular, there'll be claims for subsidies for oil, for oil prices and for consumption goods. Government need to be quite careful when giving such subsidies. There's also an issue of budget rigidities in the region. And we know that countries with higher budget rigidities tend to spend more, have higher tax rates, and spend more inefficiently. So fiscal policy response needs to be calibrated over time. And depending on shock persistence and hard budget constraints in many countries in the region, once some of these policies to help the population are introduced, it's very hard to walk back. That's what I mean by rigidities. There's a whole methodology on how to estimate rigidities that I can send to you if you're interested. So let me just conclude now. I would say first that the world is more uncertain. Global shocks keep hitting emerging markets, and the reaction of policymakers from more developed countries will add to Latin American woes. I want to say again that the biggest problem in Latin America for me is not cyclical, is steady state, low and inequitable growth. Not the topic for us today, but I think it's a deeper issue actually than maybe the cyclical issue we are discussing today. Inflation inertia is deeply rooted. Expectations need to be anchored with a credible stabilization plan. So here, I think the central banks, and I think of Colombia, that it still needs to continue raising interest rates, need to be hawkish. Fiscal authorities need to be quite careful and to be in tune to the need to do an adjustment at this point in time. Inflation is hurting consumers, especially the most vulnerable. So fiscal policy can be used to address temporary income losses among the most vulnerable. But like I just said, one needs to be quite careful on how you do, say, subsidies to energy consumption. They tend to be quite bad. They clash with sustainable growth objectives, have steep fiscal bill. We can talk about, how that interact with sustainability, including in the climate sense. Inflation is going to provide temporary relief to fiscal accounts, but it's going to increase long-run financing costs because, demand for money is going to go down in the future. It's going to be harder to issue debt. You need to give more, to promise high interest rates. It's going to generate macro instability, and inflation is a regressive tax. So anchoring inflation expectations is key here. To finalize, I'm slightly puzzled, I have to say. I haven't gone very deeply into why the current account gap continues significant in some countries in the region, including Colombia and Chile. But in some of the countries, external financing needs are widening, and at a time when capital flows are more volatile. So, flexible exchange rates will help cushioning this external volatility. But, again, the message is back to monetary policy. Monetary policy needs to be tight, needs to be active. Now is the time to be on the hawkish side, it seems to me. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Very interesting presentation, indeed. I would like to open the floor now for questions and comments from the audience. Podríamos hacerlo en español o en inglés. Entonces yo quisiera invitar a los participantes a levantar la mano si quieren comentar algo. Marcelo habla y entiende español y podemos hacerlo en cualquiera de los dos idiomas. Entonces, ¿quién quiere comenzar? María Paula Carvajal, adelante.
Thank you, Marcelo. This was really, really useful. I am concerned about the productivity point, because what you need in Latin American and emerging markets are reforms, structural reforms, and we are just dealing with all these headwinds and these cyclical problems and these external vulnerabilities. And I think the credibility is a main issue in policy, in fiscal and in monetary. So how do you see that playing in light of the restrictions of social unrest, and how do you get that trust on institutions and credibility in policy response to get and navigate through the cycle and get to that point where you just have to move on and do the reforms necessary to avoid swimming back and forth? It's a difficult question, but do you see any path and any country going towards that?
Sí, no, es verdad. Déjeme intentar hablar en español, porque yo hablo español corrientemente, pero por alguna razón no tengo el hábito de hablar en español cuando hablo de economía. Entonces, voy a intentar un poquito, vamos a ver. Sí, yo pienso que es un problema en particular para Colombia, porque hubo una transición un poco más marcada, digamos, para Colombia de que para otros países que tienen una historia más consistente de gobiernos de izquierda que después cambian para gobiernos de derecha, lo que hoy en día en Latinoamérica, por lo menos en Brasil, Argentina, los conceptos de izquierda y derecha están mucho raro para mí. Entonces, no veo. La izquierda es estatizante de una forma, la derecha estatizante de otra forma. En Colombia es más diferente, porque hay una tradición liberal más fuerte, Yo pienso, entonces, un gobierno de derecha es verdaderamente diferente de un gobierno de izquierda. No estoy seguro que en Brasil es tan diferente. Entonces, es un problema. Lo que ocurre, de nuevo, déjame hablar de Brasil un poquito, que en Brasil, por ejemplo, hubo esas transiciones, pero hay una línea coherente de reformas que empezaron en el gobierno de Fernando Collor en el empiezo de los años 90, que fue de liberalización, que hubo una liberalización comercial importante. Después no hubo más en Brasil, en verdad, pero después hubo privatización en el gobierno de Fernando Henrique Cardoso. El gobierno Lula no hizo mucho, pero continuó un poco las reformas. El gobierno Dilma cambió un poco, pero no tanto, y después las reformas más liberalizantes continuaron. Entonces, eu conozco mejor la historia de Brasil y de otros países que de Colombia. Yo diría que continuar una trayectoria básica de reformas que van en la dirección de mejorar el ambiente de negocios, el mercado laboral. Eso es importante. Si la diferencia entre los gobiernos es un gobierno de derecha es un poco menos preocupado con la protección social, un gobierno de izquierda un poco más preocupado, eso está bien. Ahora, sí, no es una cuestión económica, es una cuestión política. Lo que está ocurriendo ahora en Chile, por ejemplo, es una constitución que me preocupa un poco. Nosotros vimos eso en Brasil con la constitución de 88, que fue una constitución que básicamente acrescentó en derechos enormes, pero sin una estrategia de cómo se financia esos derechos. Me quedo un poco preocupado que en Chile la constitución nueva puede no estar financiada en el sentido económico. Pero si estuviera, muy bien, es una opción de organización de la sociedad, que no es para mí, no es mi rol, mi papel de comentar. Entonces, este cambio tiene que ser financiado. Es mi punto principal. Se es financiado con una reforma tributaria buena, muy bien. Si no es financiado, va a tener que ser financiado con debt issuance. Eso va a ser un problema para países que ya tienen una trayectoria de la deuda que no es muy benéfica.
Sí. Marcelo, yo tenía una pregunta y gracias a María Paula. Yo tenía una pregunta sobre crecimiento. Lo que hemos visto es que las proyecciones siempre, a pesar de que cada vez son más bajas, terminan siendo más optimistas porque la realidad es menor. En las proyecciones que tú mostraste se veía un pobre crecimiento en Europa, pero positivo, y lo mismo en Estados Unidos. Pero, por ejemplo, la prensa, el Financial Times, habla, The Economist, habla de recesión en Europa e incluso crecimientos más bajos en Estados Unidos. Ahora, esto es importante para Colombia, como tú mostraste, porque hay esa elasticidad de uno prácticamente entre el crecimiento de Estados Unidos y Colombia. Es decir, que el crecimiento de Estados Unidos pues no sé en qué horizonte es un buen predictor del crecimiento de Colombia. Hay una correlación muy grande. Entonces yo quisiera que nos comentaras sobre las posibilidades de recesión en Europa y en Estados Unidos, como algo que puede tener un impacto grande en Colombia.
Sí, acá, cuando hablo con los economistas americanos, yo tuve un evento 2 días atrás y me pidieron para hablar de la economía americana. Cuando hablo con ellos, yo digo siempre, la economía americana está booming. La economía americana está booming. ¿Por qué? Porque la tasa de desempleo es 3.7%. Pero, entonces, lo que estamos viendo, que es una desaceleración económica en los Estados Unidos, es necesaria. Entonces, hay una convergencia del producto americano para el producto potencial por arriba. Entonces, sí, la economía está booming en niveles, pero va a haber una convergencia, porque uno de los motores de la inflación americana, con certeza el motor principal, es la demanda. Muy bien. Entonces, lo que estoy diciendo es que para un país como Colombia, que Colombia se aprovechó mucho desse crescimento americano, já aproveitou desse grande nível de produção nos Estados Unidos. Então, para os trimestres que vêm, o impulso da economia americana vai ser fraco para a Colômbia. Pero, de novo, não pode parecer uma semântica, mas não é semântica. A economia americana está booming. Esse que é o que é importante. Para eu cambiar de narrativa, eu tenho que ter uma taxa de desemprego de 5,5%, 5%. Pero para chegar allá, vai haver uma desaceleração econômica nos Estados Unidos. E com isso, o impulso para a economia colombiana vai ser muito mais fraco. Então, talvez nossas previsões para o continente latino-americano não seja tão realista. Vamos ver, estamos revisando agora, estamos revisando a previsão. É também muito difícil de prever uma recessão, porque, por exemplo, a Colômbia está crescendo o quê? 6% esse ano, talvez, ao final de ano. Então, se a taxa de crescimento diminui por la metade, são 3%. Então, me parece um pouco demasiado dizer que vai crescer zero ou negativo. Então, 2023 vai ser um ano mais difícil para a região em geral e penso que para a Colômbia, sim. Okay. Em particular, porque o preço de petróleo está caindo e também o preço de carbono. Yeah.
Sí, gracias, Marcelo. Santiago Montenegro. Santiago, adelante.
Gracias, Armando, y gracias, Marcelo, por esa presentación tan completa e interesante. Voy a hablar también en español. Y quiero un poco, digamos, ligar tu análisis con algunos factores más estructurales de Colombia, ¿no? De Colombia. En Colombia tenemos una productividad bajísima, la más baja de la OECD, ¿no? Que es causa y consecuencia al mismo tiempo de una informalidad gigantesca, ¿no? La informalidad laboral puede estar por encima del 60%. En alguna forma, estas dos variables explican unos recaudos fiscales supremamente bajos. Los ingresos del gobierno central están alrededor del 14% del PIB, ¿no? Y concomitante con esto, en Colombia tenemos una tasa de ahorro bajísima, ¿no? Históricamente había estado alrededor del 18% del PIB, ¿no? Que contrasta pues con tasas de ahorro como de China del 40-45%. Pero más recientemente en Colombia la tasa de ahorro, las últimas tasas de ahorro están alrededor de 13.5% del Producto Interno Bruto, ¿no? Y la tasa de inversión, consecuencia, también es muy baja, alrededor del 20%. Y la diferencia explica el déficit en cuenta corriente de la balanza de pagos, ¿sí? Entonces se vienen una serie de reformas, como tú dijiste, ¿no? En un gobierno nuevo, de izquierda, que no conocemos bien, ¿no? Una de esas reformas es una reforma pensional, que si hacen lo que dijeron durante la campaña, ¿no? El gobierno no ha sacado todavía el proyecto de reforma, lo dejó para el próximo año. Pero lo que dijo Petro y su equipo durante la campaña es básicamente que los flujos de ahorro del sistema de capitalización, tú sabes, en Colombia tenemos dos regímenes que compiten, Capitalization System and Pay As You Go, ¿no? Básicamente lo que dijeron es que los flujos de ahorro van al Pay As You Go, ¿no? Pero se lo van a gastar en subsidios, ¿no? En el corto plazo eso puede producir una caída en el ahorro nacional de un 2,5% del PIB, ¿no? 2,5%. Si eso pasa, ceteris paribus, el déficit en cuenta corriente se puede subir a entre 8 y 9 puntos del Producto Interno Bruto, lo que es insostenible por las razones que tú has dicho, ¿no? Entonces quería mencionarte esos factores más estructurales y la relación, la baja tasa de ahorro, ¿no? Y la relación del sistema pensional de capitalización al ahorro nacional y lo que puede pasar si se hace una reforma de ese tipo. Me gustaría conocer tu opinión y si estás de acuerdo con esto que he dicho.
Yes, let me try in English a little bit now, because I do think I'm a bit more, I'm a bit smarter in English. Your question is quite related to what was asked before. The whole issue of, here in my notes, credibility versus productivity, how you link that to social unrest, the problem of, seesawing economic policy. So we have a government of one tradition, then change to another one. My answer to that question was, it's okay, of course, society changes, it's okay to change, but it is important to have there is some notion that efficiency is important, that you mentioned productivity is low in Colombia. It's remarkable. If you look at total factor productivity in Colombia, the levels seem to be the same as in the 90s. So it's quite remarkable, actually, how low has been total factor productivity growth in Colombia. It's not the only country, by the way, in the region. Brazil is equally bad, I would say. So, and then the question here is how to jumpstart that so we can have more of a pie to be shared. It's related to your question on the savings rate, on the need to borrow so much from abroad to continue growing. Colombia has, I would say, structural current account deficit of maybe between 3 and 4%, let's say 4% in equilibrium, because, like you said, investment rates are higher than the savings rate. So you need to borrow from abroad to close the gap. I think the way to solve this is to have reforms that improve the functioning of the economy. These are deep reforms that you need to do it. In the case of, things that I've heard about Colombia, I'm not, again, a specialist, that there's still quite a bit you have to do in terms of tariff reform, both non-tariff and tariff barriers to international trade. So there's still some stuff that you can do like that. To aid job creation and bring employment closer to pre-pandemic levels, lowering barriers to firm and labor formalization, that would help reduce structural unemployment and enhance productivity, would help to deal with the informality issue that you mentioned. So to extend the social safety net, maybe, the introduction of social protection floor, if I'm not mistaken, was Colombia, introduced that, grants access to social security benefits to, 10 million workers earning less than the minimum wage. That makes sense, because I think in a modern society you need that. But again, you need to finance this. And you're going to have more money to finance this by having reforms in the way of doing business that raises growth. So I think at the end of the day, and the solution is going to depend from country to country. So if I talk about the Mercosur countries, we are talking about the economies that are incredibly close, much more close than Colombia. So there, the big reform that needs to come is opening up that block. That needs to be opened up. And if you talk about other reforms, say in Brazil, is basically a very heavy tax system. Brazil has very high tax to GDP compared to its level of income, and very cumbersome. So a tax system with each of the 27 states having different tax rates and all that. So this is a big reform that needs to happen. So you need to find the same for Colombia. Anyway, so.
No, Marcelo, but let me stress the point I made about the pension system. If the government goes with the original proposal, that's going to hit the savings rate. If you weaken the capitalization system, the savings rate, coming from the capitalization system, which at the moment is around 5% of GDP, might in the short run be halved, just 2.5%. And that's going to cut growth, investment, and it's going to worsen the current account of the balance of payments. I want you to have that in mind, because usually, pension policy is not, usually people do not relate this to the current account of the balance of payments.
So you don't think there'll be a countervailing increase in the savings rate because people realize that they need to save more for retirement? That's too rational. That's
no, that's extremely rational. And the government will use that money not only to reduce the deficit, but they've said that they're going to spend that in subsidies, in different types of subsidies.
I see.
That's the problem.
Ok, gracias Santiago, gracias Marcelo. Gabriel Silva tiene una pregunta sobre las relaciones de flujos y geopolítica. Vamos a ver, Gabriel, adelante.
Gracias Armando, no, es que muchas gracias Marcelo por esta interesantísima conferencia y conversación. Simplemente me quedó sonando muchísimo el comentario al inicio de la presentación de que la situación de flujo de capitales en China estaba muy asociado a la situación geopolítica. Mi pregunta, que entiendo tiene un elemento especulativo, es esa misma situación geopolítica o las tendencias geopolíticas que estás viendo y que afectan a China hoy, ¿tendrían algún impacto en el comportamiento en el mediano plazo del flujo de capitales para América Latina?
Essa é uma pergunta excelente. É dificílima de responder, de contestar, pero sim, eu estou em um lado um pouco mais negativo, um pouco mais pessimista de lo que está ocorrendo no mundo. Penso que este cambio geopolítico é um cambio verdadeiro e mais profundo de lo que muitos pensam. Por exemplo, penso que isso está também ligado à crise da deuda de los países menos desarrollados em África, por exemplo. Há uma crise da deuda lá. Também em Sri Lanka, em Líbano. Esses países estão sendo financiados por capital flows da China, do governo chinês, do governo chino, perdão. Então, este financiamento vai diminuir, já diminuiu e vai diminuir mais no futuro. Então, esse é um aspecto do que está ocorrendo com capital flows. Não é exatamente, não estou falando de capital flows privados, capital flows oficiais da China, e eu penso que vão cair. Agora, a pergunta é, vão cair também para a Latinoamérica? A Latinoamérica não tem uma crise da deuda. Por que vai cair? Penso que vai cair em todo o mundo. Então, o tema é o que vai ocorrer nessa situação. Bom, provavelmente um crescimento da taxa de interesse no mundo, provavelmente. Porque esse capital flow, esse era um capital que estava entrando, que não vai entrar mais. Os países vão ter que financiar uma diferença entre a taxa de inversão, no caso de Colômbia, e a taxa de ahorro. Vão ter que financiar esse current account balance de uma maneira provavelmente um pouco diferente, porque parte estavam financiando com o capital chino, por exemplo. Esse é um tema importante. Não vejo muita gente falando disso, pero neste mundo que está mais desintegrado, isso é um tema importante. Em termos de capitais privados, vai depender do que vai ocorrer na guerra da Ucrânia. Porque a China aún é um país com 1,5 bilhões de pessoas, mil milhões de pessoas, e por isso é um mercado enorme, é muito importante para todos. Então, se houver um pouco de uma estabilização, penso que parte desse capital vai envolver a China. pero para eso depende de una normalización de las relaciones políticas en aquella región. Sin eso, eso no va a ocurrir. Entonces, el capital va a procurar otras salidas. Eso puede beneficiar Latinoamérica. Porque de una manera, si se piensa un poco en la región de una manera relativa, países en verdad como Brasil van a aprovechar, tal vez Colombia también, porque son países que están lejos de la región de la crisis de Ucrania, son países que son exportadores de commodities, aún con los precios de las commodities cayendo. Y no, son países exportadores de commodities y los precios están elevados, aunque no tan elevados que hace 2, 3 meses atrás. Entonces, puede ser que parte de ese capital privado vuelva para América Latina de una manera relativa, porque no va a ir para el Oriente Medio, probablemente. No va a ir para el sur de Asia, porque hay una crisis en Sri Lanka, Pakistán tiene una situación macroeconómica complicada, India sí, pero está decelerando un poco el crecimiento, tal vez no va a cambiar nada en relación a India. Latinoamérica tiene una oportunidad para ser un centro de atracción de capital si las políticas domésticas, y acá es un grande sí, las políticas fueran buenas. Eu não puedo dizer nada de los gobiernos actuales, porque eu não hablo de los gobiernos, solamente de las políticas. El gobierno colombiano es muy temprano para hablar de lo que está haciendo, es un gobierno nuevo, pero es el momento de tener ajustadas las condiciones domésticas. Piensa bien, no hay guerra en Latinoamérica. Son, de nuevo, regiones que son muy productivas en agroproductos, en minerales, en combustibles. Me parece que solamente son cuestiones domésticas que van a impedir una atracción de ese capital que puede no ir tanto para China. En el momento está running away from China. It's not going there.
Okay. Gracias, Marcelo. Gracias, Gabriel. Astrid Martínez, adelante.
Gracias, Marcelo. Muy interesante, muy lleno de temas muy que nos llenan de preocupación y otras preguntas, pero yo quisiera como aprovechar este espacio de tu respuesta para ampliar un punto que me inquieta, y es lo relacionado con las recomendaciones que suelen dar los macroeconomistas en términos de desarrollo sostenible o de política ambiental, que siempre se relaciona con la reducción de los subsidios a la energía y con los impuestos al carbono. En el contexto de esta conversación, hoy se destaca el aspecto que tiene relación con inflación y consumo, de la tensión que hay entre esos distintos objetivos de política, tratar de tener una política fiscal para sostener a los consumidores más vulnerables, y por otro lado tener que usar estos instrumentos que van a impactar a esos hogares. Pues se habla de focalización en los subsidios, pero pues eso es algo que es un recurso que todavía no ha mostrado muchos resultados por distintos temas, como relacionados con la focalización, etc. Pero siempre todo esto, además, de otro lado, me llama a mí la atención en la discusión que yo creo que tiene que haber diferencias entre lo que es el diseño de políticas públicas en países desarrollados alrededor de estos temas de sostenibilidad y consumo de energía. Y es que si bien en los países desarrollados se pueden proponer políticas para reducir el consumo, para elevar la eficiencia energética, concomitante con todo este grupo de instrumentos, en estos países estamos en una senda en la cual el desarrollo humano supone una elevación del consumo per cápita de energía, ¿no? Entonces, es un poco para motivar que nos converses en medio de lo que conoces y de los otros países y de las otras políticas en términos de sostenibilidad, porque yo siempre tengo la impresión de que los macroeconomistas hablan de eso y no de los otros instrumentos para las políticas ambientales. Y creo que en el caso nuestro tienen muchas limitaciones las recomendaciones únicamente desde la perspectiva macro.
Sim, não é verdade. Eu diria que eu penso nesse tema de duas maneiras diferentes. Há uma questão estrutural, que o mundo tem que consumir menos fossil fuel-based fuels based on fossil fuels, and tem que consumir mais combustíveis que são renováveis. Esse é um tema para todos. Agora, se estamos falando de país como os Estados Unidos, o que tem que convencer é a população americana que it's okay to pay more for tax, pay more for gas when you put gas in your car, because that's financing a transition, an energetic transition. If you're talking to Chad, to people in Chad, it's okay to take oil from the ground because you're a very poor country and you need that oil to kind of finance your development. If you're talking, so I'm going to get to your point. If you're talking to Norway, the advice is no, don't take oil from the ground. I know you're very rich because of that, but do not do that. Or if you do that, take that income and transfer to Chad, or pay a price for contributing to this bad global good that is global warming. So the advice, both on the production side and the consumption side, is going to depend a lot on which country you're talking about. So what is important that the prices are, quote unquote, right. So it is important that the price for consuming fossil fuels is elevated vis-a-vis of the cost to produce and distribute, because you need to incorporate the cost for society as a whole of people consuming fossil fuels. So, right, but then you say, and the poor? Well, first of all, subsidies to fuel consumption tend to be quite regressive, because the rich is the one that uses mostly cars that consume a lot of energy and gasoline. The poor consumes bus fares as well, of course, and that has an impact. But there has been some studies that certainly for a large set of countries, that subsidies to energy consumption of fossil fuel-based energy is actually regressive if you just do across the board. Now, there's a debate if that's true or not, but anyway, but it's a debate that needs to have. I got concerned by your point that it's hard to focalize transfers, although you said subsidies in Colombia. I would say that in general, the general advice would be you raise the price, you raise taxes on goods that are bad for the environment, and then you lower the taxes that are distortive in terms of people's decision to invest and to save. The consumption tax related to the consumption of fossil fuels affects everybody. It doesn't distort your decision to work or have leisure. Now, a tax on labor, and I think a previous commentator talked about informality, that does affect. So maybe a tax reform that you raise those indirect taxes, but lower payroll taxes. Actually, one can show, and a colleague of mine has written a paper on that can be expansionary action, because the negative impact on economic activity of raising the indirect taxes is smaller than the positive impact of reducing the tax on labor. So, I mean, is this true for Colombia? You need to do the calibrations for Colombia. So I would say, in general, when you talk about these issues, they are more structural. I would try to disentangle from what's happening right now. So you need to have a strategy that is long-term, that price things right according to the goods or bads for society. Then when you face a shock like now, you can deviate from this. So now maybe prices just went too high for gasoline, let's say. So it's okay, you do a little bit, but not too much, because you don't want to distort that structural signal that you want to give to people, that you should be consuming less gasoline. It's very hard, and it's very country-specific, and general answers, I think the answer is what I just said, but the general answers are a bit unsatisfactory, because you need to really calibrate for the reality of your country in terms of exactly the amounts. And so countries like, again, Brazil, that I know a bit better, have all the mechanism to transfer income directly to the poor. We have many programs of income transfer. We can use those programs to say you tax gasoline more. With that income, you transfer directly to the people through the income tax system, a lump sum to the people, independent of how much they consume in gasoline, based on how much you collected from taxes by taxing gasoline more, for instance. That's very doable.
Ok, gracias Marcelo, gracias Astrid. No hay más manos levantadas.
Daniel está hablando algo, Daniel Gómez.
Daniel, adelante. Daniel.
Gracias. No, un comentario breve. Y yo creo que en Colombia sí tenemos buenos instrumentos de focalización y ya hemos desarrollado y mostrado buena capacidad operativa también para lograr diseñar esquemas como los que Marcelo mencionó, donde no se subsidie toda la gasolina para absolutamente todo el mundo, sino que se haga corresponder mejor ese precio con las externalidades y con el costo social y con los costos sociales, a la vez compensando a los más vulnerables y más pobres con un esquema de transferencia monetaria no condicionada vía herramientas como el CISBEN 4, que ya es pues una mejora significativa con respecto al CISBEN 3, y ya pues es un instrumento con ya casi 40 años de historia en Colombia, y con lo aprendido a partir de la pandemia con el ingreso solidario, con devolución del IVA. Entonces yo no echaría en saco roto esa sugerencia de política micro, que tendría también impactos pues macro interesantes.
Sí, eso puede ser hecho de una manera neutra. Se puede hacer, porque, de nuevo, no estoy hablando del diseño del gobierno. Eso depende de lo que la sociedad quiere. Es importante que el diseño sea financiado de una manera no inflacionaria. Eso es lo que es importante.
Ok, muchas gracias, Daniel, Marcelo. No veo más manos levantadas y si no alguien en este momento no levanta la mano, vamos a despedir la sesión. Entonces, Marcelo, muchísimas gracias. Muy interesante, nos dejas muy buena información, muy buenas ideas, en fin, muchas inquietudes sobre el manejo económico de Colombia en vista de la situación mundial. Te agradecemos mucho en nombre de todo este grupo y quiero invitarlos a despedir a Marcelo con un aplauso muy grande. Marcelo, muchas gracias.
No, muchas gracias. Sí, fue un placer. Si quieren más información, la presentación, no, hay mucho que hablar, no hay tanto tiempo. Podemos continuar con emails o...
Sí, Marcelo, la presentación sí te agradecería que me la mandes.
Perfecto, sí.
Para distribuirla entre este grupo, porque me parece que hay unos datos y unos cuadros extraordinarios. Muchas gracias.
Sí.